Now, how has the transatlantic slave trade impacted on life in the 21st century, and what can be learnt from that time? And why is it important that it's taught in schools? A team from the University of York's Archaeology Department are working with researchers from around the world on an EU-funded project which is trying to understand what life was like for the slaves and what impact it has on society now. One of those researchers is Jessica Hendy.
Eurotest is a large group of different researchers, and we're all based around different institutions in Europe, and we are looking at the history and legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. So this is involving anthropologists, historians, and scientists as well.
And why is it so important to actually look at the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade?
The slave trade has a really big legacy for all populations throughout the Atlantic, but especially Britain. And so that's why, as an EU-funded group, it's really important for the EU's legacy.
We assume, Winston, that everybody knows about the transatlantic slave trade, but just tell us a little bit about it. What kind of period are we talking about?
We're talking about the 16th century all the way up to the 19th century. A movement of, the estimate is about 12 million people have been moved from West Africa across the entire Atlantic. People went to Europe, people went to South America, the Caribbean, the USA. So it's a very long period and a very massive forced migration that we're talking about.
And presumably, it is a painful time in history as well for an awful lot of people.
A very painful time in history, and I think that's why it still resonates with the entire Atlantic society. People are still dealing with the trauma of having been dislocated from what was their homeland, essentially.
What kind of traumas do they still deal with? I mean,
well, you see it all the time. We have African descendant populations in societies that have predominantly of European descent, the UK, across Western Europe, the USA, Canada, and so on. And these people are minorities essentially in the society, and for them, a lot of the disadvantages that they experience or claim to experience has a lot to do with the legacies of that time, that 300-year period that we're talking about.
So how does archaeology tie in with this? Because it's described as an archaeology project, but as Jessica has explained, it involves lots of different areas, doesn't it?
Well, it is archaeology, but using different tools of archaeology to answer the questions that we're being asked. What were the diseases that people suffered from? What are the origins of the people? Using molecular DNA, molecular biology to answer that question. What were the cultures the historians are looking at? What do people think about it now? The anthropologists are looking at what's the impact on society today? The anthropologists are also looking at. So it's a very wide project, and we're answering lots of broad questions that have not been asked before.
Now, you're looking at the anthropological side of it.
Yes, I'm looking at the memory of the contemporary memory of the slave trade and slavery in the Atlantic world. I'm looking at West Africa, Europe, North America, and the Caribbean specifically.
And what have you found out so far in your research?
Oh, it's very interesting. The beauty of memory is what people want to remember. So it's always about choice, and what the society decides is important to remember. And throughout the Atlantic, there's a type of silence about slavery. It's there, but it's not spoken of openly. In academic circles, yes, but in society in general, it's not spoken of openly. I'm speaking about the entire Atlantic, North America. Whether you want to talk about North America, West Africa, the Caribbean, or even Europe.
And is that because it's too painful, or is there an embarrassment there to talk about it?
Oh, we could drill all the way down and rip it apart, but I think it has to do with today's society. A lot of people think that history is the past, but it's important because we're thinking about it now. It's impacting on us now. So I think the difficulties are based on the fact that people are choosing what to remember based on what their needs are, and that's very political.
And presumably, to be able to understand that enables communities to move forward and live in the future.
Well, yeah, moving forward from the trauma that was. Also, people say that is.
Yes, well, but how do you change mentality? Because you'll be researching this, you'll also be talking to people about, what their families experience, but it's not just about those families, it's about the societies that they live within as well, isn't it, and their attitudes?
Yeah, I think it could be, well, we could talk about it for a very long time, but I think education is the biggest issue. Well, in my research so far, education on the Atlantic slave trade is not something that's very common. In primary schools, there's very little taught about it. In secondary school, it's an option. You could choose not to deal with it at all. At university, I mean, you can graduate with a PhD and never experience anything that has anything to do with this transatlantic slave trade or slavery. And it's Atlantic-wide. When I say Atlantic, I'm speaking about the four corners: North America, Western Europe, West Africa, and the Caribbean. So, yeah, education is the only way. If it's in people's consciousness, then it has to be dealt with. If it's not, then we could ignore it.
More about the project in a moment. So how has the transatlantic slave trade impacted on life in the 21st century? It's what archaeology is all about today on our regular archaeology feature. A team from the University of York Archaeology Department are working with researchers from around the world on an EU-funded project which is trying to understand what life was like for the slaves and what impact it has on society today. Well, Jessica Hendy is one of those researchers looking at the science behind the slave trade. So how does science and archaeology go together?
They're married together surprisingly well. So what I'm doing is looking at diseases that were around during the era of the slave trade. So I'm looking at skeletons and extracting ancient DNA and ancient proteins to try and find some of the kind of biomolecular remnants of the diseases from these individuals.
So where have the skeletons come from?
So they come from a small, kind of unknown South Atlantic island called St. Helena. And St. Helena actually played a very important role during Britain's campaign to abolish the slave trade. It acted as what's called a vice admiralty court. So it tried ships and their captains who were performing illegal slave trading in the 19th century. And on this island, it acted as kind of a place for recuperation for enslaved people that were liberated from the ships. And clearly a lot of people also died there because they were taken off slave ships, which are very terrible ships to be on. So they were excavated about 6 years ago, and now we're using these skeletons as a way to try and find more information about these individuals and about the 19th century slave trading.
When I think about those boats, the first disease that comes to mind is scurvy, because presumably there's a lot of scurvy around at that time.
That's true, a lot of scurvy. That also affected the crew of the ships as well. But the main diseases that were around were things like smallpox, dysentery, things that spread very quickly, very infectious diseases.
Why is it important as part of this project that you understand, the diseases that they had?
So some of the diseases have been eradicated, like smallpox, but some are still very prevalent in the Atlantic world. So you have diseases that are African in origin, but were actually taken over to the Caribbean, to South America and North America, and are still prevalent now.
And with this research, how will it sort of tie up with what Winston's doing, which is looking at the legacy, the memory, and how we actually move forward in the 21st century?
So I guess just like people memorialise the slave trade in different ways, it has that lasting legacy, but disease is another legacy of the slave trade.
What will happen when you've collected all the information? Because I think this project is 3 or 4 years, isn't it, this EU-funded project?
4 years.
What will happen with all that information?
Well, we hope to deliver as much information as we can to the public, and also in more academic writing as well. And in terms of disease, I think it's really interesting that we can look at, say, a DNA sequence of a disease from the past and see how it's changed through time. And that might be very relevant to, say, a modern study that's looking at the same particular disease.
And Winston, how much would you hope as a result of what you find that schools will take a more open approach and talk more about the slave trade?
I'm a little pessimistic when it comes to, because of what I've seen. We know education is about policy and history is very political. I'm hoping that the information goes out there and people understand the need to actually disseminate a little more, speak more on the slave trade, educate people on what the slave trade was about and how it's impacting on us today. How much of that will get into the school and the curriculum depends on political policy and what policymakers think of the issue.
That's Winston Fulgence there and Jessica Hendy, part of that research team from the University of York's Archaeology Department. It's a fascinating study. To find out more, eurotast.eu. There are people involved from all around the world. And like myself, you might learn something. I was absolutely fascinated by the topic and the fact that archaeologists were involved in the research. If you go to our Facebook page, you'll be able to find out more details there.